inconvenientes técnicos. Muy buenos días a todos. El día de hoy, en el seminario de la Academia de Acuicultura, tenemos a una invitada especial, la doctora Carolina Martínez Gutiérrez. La doctora Carolina es licenciada en Biología Marina por la Universidad Autónoma de Baja California Sur. Hizo su maestría en Ciencias en el CIPNOR y desarrolló su posgrado, su doctorado en el Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University en Estados Unidos. Actualmente la doctora Carolina se dedica a, está en un postdoctorado en el Simmons Foundation en North Carolina State University en Estados Unidos. El día de hoy nos trae este interesante tema sobre bacterias y vamos a escucharla con mucha atención porque está muy interesante lo que nos trae el día de hoy. Doctora, muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Agradecemos mucho y pues adelante, quedamos atentos a lo que nos comenta.
Muchas gracias por la introducción y muchas gracias a Eduardo por invitarme. Voy a dar la plática en inglés porque sí me pueden escuchar, ¿verdad?
Sí, perfectamente.
Okay. Voy a dar la plática en inglés porque me es muchísimo más fácil hablar de todas estas cosas que hago en inglés, me cuesta mucho trabajo traducirlo al español. Entonces, si tienen preguntas, las puedo contestar en español. All right, so today I'll be talking about, so this was like the last chapter of my PhD dissertation. And for this project, we were interested in developing a timeline of bacterial and archaeal diversification in the ocean. So I always start my presentations on this topic with this quote by John Canfield that was presented in the book Oxygen. This is one of my favorite books. And it reads, we sometimes need to look at modern organisms and modern ecosystems to see how they work. They provide important clues to help us understand how the ancient world worked, especially in details that a geological record can easily provide. And I like it because this summarizes very well the research interest that I have, which is using phylogenomics to try to figure out what happened in the past, especially for microbes, for bacteria and archaea. So one important thing about our world in general is that we live in a microbial world. And I say this because bacteria and archaea are the most ancient, diverse, and abundant life forms on our planet. And as you can see on this figure on the right, the first half of Earth's history was exclusively microbial. And we have very good evidence that points to that the first life forms on the planet were microbial. So yeah, microbes were out there for a very, very long time. And also microbes were responsible for large geological changes. And I think the most representative one is the Great Oxidation Event. I will talk about it in more detail in a few slides. Do not worry if you don't know what I'm talking about. But this was carried by cyanobacteria. And microbes are also very interesting because they are considered to be living fossils that can inform us about the nature of early life. Again, since they are extremely ancient, by looking into their genomes, we can get some clues about how life looked in the past. And of course, most of us know that microbes drive the geochemistry of our planet today. So they are extremely important. And specifically in the ocean and the modern ocean, microbes are responsible for the geochemistry, and they mediate many of the nutrient transformations that help the other life forms thriving in the ocean, for example, animals and plants and so on. So for example, microbes are involved in carbon fixation. Phytoplankton fixes carbon dioxide, and this is transformed to organic matter. And so many trophic levels depend on this. They are also responsible, of course, of oxygen production. They transform organic matter, which is also very important for other trophic levels. So even if we are studying fish or plants, like microbes will always be important to understand other trophic levels. They are also in charge of inorganic nutrients transformations, for example, iron, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Phosphorus is very important in the ocean, so microbes are involved in that. And they are also mediate the transformations of gases that are important for climate. Some gases that are that have to do with nitrogen. Microbes are really involved in these processes. And it turns out, very interestingly, that early phylogenetic analyses that were based on the recovery of clones directly from marine water, or they already identified the most abundant clades in the ocean. And what people found is that 80% of the sequences recovered through clones belong to a few clades that I'm showing in this phylogenetic tree here. And as you can see, we have clades belonging to archaea, but also to bacteria. So all these clades, when I say clade, I mean like a distinctive phylogenetic group. They are distributed across the entire tree of life, again, because we have archaea and we have bacteria. And these microbes that are extremely abundant in the ocean have very different metabolic diversity, or the metabolic diversity they present is extremely diverse, because we have phototrophs, and here we can find the famous Picocyanobacteria. For those that are not familiar with Prochlorococcus, for example, this is the most abundant phototroph on Earth. So it's in charge of fixing a lot of carbon dioxide in the ocean. So as I said, they have a phototrophic metabolism. There's also heterotrophs. So these are microbes that can use organic matter as a source of energy and carbon. And here we have all the famous SARS. So these SARS clades were they were first identified through clones from the Sargasso Sea. And now they have other names, but people use these names because it's easy. These names are easier. And we have other clades that have a mixotrophic metabolism, for example, SAR324. They can use carbon dioxide, but also organic matter as sources of carbon. And there are other microbes that are chemioautotrophs, so they use inorganic sources of energy. In this case, marine group 1, the one that I'm showing here with the arrow, uses ammonium as a source of energy, and they can fix carbon. So we know a lot about the diversity of these clades, what they are doing in the ocean, their metabolism, even although some of them have not been cultured yet, but we don't know much about the timing of their emergence across Earth's history. And this has been very challenging because, as I said, these clades are present in archaea and bacteria, so studying them at one single time is very hard because you have to have a phylogenetic tree that includes both groups at the same time. But of course, knowing when these clades diversify is very important because we need to know when they diversified, under what environmental conditions, and that can give us clues about what's going to happen with these clades in the future, especially with all these environmental changes that are happening in the modern ocean. Okay. We will go a little bit to the past to understand what happened during in the ocean during the last 3 billion years. So the first thing is that the surface ocean was anoxic until 2.4 billion years ago. Anoxic means no oxygen. And the deep ocean, so below the photic zone where light is not present, the deep ocean became oxygenated around 0.5 billion years ago, so 500 million years ago. And before that, the deep ocean was transitioning between euxinic and ferruginous conditions. These are very rough conditions for life because sulfur is present, iron becomes very abundant, so very tough for life. I could imagine that only microbial life can live there. And we know this because there are some representatives of these very extreme environmental conditions in some lakes today on Earth. And another important thing is that the ocean has changed dramatically during the last 3 billion years of Earth's history. So for context, Earth is around 4.6 billion years old. So during the last 3 billion years, there were many plate tectonic changes. So this is the movement of continents, and this has caused changes in the distance of the ocean from land. And these changes in plate tectonics have led to changes in the geochemistry and biodiversity of our planet. So, but what happened with oxygen, for example? Because we know oxygen is very important on Earth today. Oxygen is very abundant. Animals and plants, like the oxygen is very important for them, but oxygen was not always there. So for this slide, I'm going to walk you through the last, again, 3.5 billion years of Earth's history in terms of oxygen. So here we have present day on the left, and the x-axis is showing millions of years. So as you can see, 3,500 million years ago, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and there was no oxygen in the ocean. So we know at some point there was photosynthesis evolving, but we don't know when actually. There are some ideas, some fossils, some geochemistry that give us some clues, but it's not really clear when photosynthesis happened. So what we know is that it happened before 2.4 billion years ago, or 2,400 million years ago, because this is when the Great Oxidation event happened. So the Great Oxidation event is this period of Earth history when oxygen became available for the first time. And so people think that this could have been related with the geochemistry of our planet, but most people now believe that it was in response to the metabolic activities of cyanobacteria. So this super famous group of photosynthetic microbes that produce oxygen. So they became so abundant and so successful on early Earth that they were leading to the Great Oxidation event. So oxygen was present for the first time. And as you can see, the surface ocean had some oxygen. We don't really know how much or how well oxygenated the surface ocean was, but the deep ocean was completely oxygen-free. And after the Great Oxidation event, there were some sinks of oxygen during early Earth. And this period is known as the boring billion. Some people don't like this term, but we don't know what really happened during this time in terms of oxygen. It seems there were ups and downs. So this was a very unstable period in terms of oxygen concentration. But actually, it was not so boring, because this is the time when eukaryotes were first appearing and diversifying. And it was not until the Phanerozoic oxidation event that I show here with green, and the Neoproterozoic oxidation event, when oxygen reached the concentrations that we see on Earth today. So the surface ocean was fully oxygenated, as well as the deep ocean. So yeah, this is more or less what happened in terms of oxygen across Earth history. And we have an idea of what happened during early Earth because we have all this geochemistry, but we don't know much about the nature of Earth's early life. And this is because the oldest sedimentary rocks, which is where we will expect to see these microfossils of, for example, microbial life, have gone through extensive alterations. And again, this is because we have subduction. So this is when the upper part of the planet gets recycled. Rocks are recycled, and this is very important for example, the long-term carbon cycle in our planet. But of course, this deletes any evidence of early life. So it's very hard to study early life. And there is a poor representation across the tree of life of bacteria and archaea. So we have some microfossils. As you can see in this figure here, we have some microfossils, but most of them have been assigned to cyanobacteria, because cyanobacteria can make these very specialized structures that are easily preserved in the fossil record, but this is like an exception. Other microbes, we could probably see things that look microbial in the fossil record, but we cannot really assign these clades to anything that we have learned or that we know right now. So it's extremely hard to study early life. Luckily for us, now we have DNA sequences And DNA sequences are extremely interesting because they can give us information about the timing and processes that were involved in early biological diversification processes. So in this sense, people have suggested that the DNA is like a biological record. And that's because there are changes being accumulated in modern organisms. And these changes in the nucleotides that we can analyze now are accumulated at a certain rate. So we can really use that information to see or to get clues or ideas about how life looked in the past. And so the idea is that we can use computational methods together with DNA sequences to try to figure out how the earliest microbes look like. And this is especially important right now because we have this enormous plethora of genomic sequences available. Most databases are kind of biased towards certain organisms, for example, those that are important for human health. But we have so many genomes available right now. This is the Genome Taxonomy database. This is a database that I use almost every day. So we can see here the number of bacterial and archaeal species that we have available. So these are freely available and anyone can download these genomes. And so the main goal of this project was using, trying to complement the geological record and DNA sequences. So that was the main idea of this project. So the method that I used to try to figure out the nature of early life on Earth, and specifically looking into these marine microbes I talked about before, I did this process through phylogenomics. So for those of you that are not so familiar with phylogenomics, you will learn a little bit. But for those of you that are very familiar with phylogenomics, this is just going to be like a review. So phylogenetic trees, like the one we are seeing here, is a diagram in which species are arranged based on evolutionary relationships. So one of the assumptions of phylogenetic trees is that all organisms share a common ancestor. So this idea came since Darwin. So it's very interesting because a phylogenetic tree, if it's rooted, can give us information about the sequence of diversification events and evolutionary relationships. So for example, here, besides knowing about the evolutionary relationships between all the clades that we are studying here, which are in this case, we are looking into animals, we can, for example, say that cartilaginous fish were the most ancestral, or one of the most ancestral group in this group of animals. So we can get extra information besides the evolutionary relationship. So in the case of microbes, unfortunately, we don't have very good pictures of microbes for this phylogenetic tree. And we can get additional information about, for example, when this clade diversified, this hypothetical group that I'm looking here, was oxygen available in the atmosphere at the time of the diversification of the clade? Or, for example, we can know what are the metabolic pathways that drove the diversification. So these are all questions that we can try to answer by looking into phylogenetic relationships and looking into the branching of our phylogenetic trees. So the main questions of this project were, for example, when did the most relevant marine microbial clades emerge, the ones I talked about previously? And what were the innovations that drove their emergence? And we were also interested in knowing how was the environmental context in which they diversified, because again, by knowing when they diversified, we can get an idea of how these clades will respond to future environmental conditions. So this was a paper that came out December last year. But before that, so all these methods are amazing, but they rely on, or they assume that you have a good phylogenetic tree, because their main assumption is that you are showing most of the programs the true evolutionary relationships among the clades. And when I started working on this project, I realized that everyone was using different methods, and there was not a very standardized a sequence of steps to build phylogenetic trees. And because of that, before getting into the fun part of investigating the evolutionary relationships or a geological history of marine clades, I needed to come up with a good pipeline for the reconstruction of phylogenetic. So before getting into that story, I will very briefly explain you how we develop a pipeline for the reconstruction of phylogenetic trees. I think I was talking about this project a few years ago, if not as well. So yeah, I just want to give you some context of why building good phylogenetic trees is so important for any project that has to do with evolutionary relationships. So, okay, just again, a few steps of how phylogenetic trees are reconstructed. Again, if you are familiar with phylogenomics, this is just going to be a review, but I want to tell students how these things work if you are not familiar with phylogenomics. So we start with collecting genomes. So for example, we can get genomes from samples. This is a nice phylogenetic, microbial map. But we can also get genomes from databases. Again, my favorite one is the Genome Taxonomy database. And once you have your genomes, you have to kind of target marker gene sequences. So in this figure, this part of the slide, each row represents a sequence, and each of the colors represents the 4 different nucleotides. So here I'm kind of showing a hypothetical marker gene sequence, and you must be wondering what a marker gene is. So these are DNA sequences that are homologous across all the species that you are analyzing in your study. So one of the most famous marker genes for microbes is 16S rRNA, although there are many issues associated with the use of that marker gene. It's definitely the most famous one. We tend to use marker genes that have gone through vertical evolution, and we have this assumption that the gene was present in the last common ancestor, because again, we want to investigate the diversification events since the last common ancestor. And because of that, we need to have genes that can represent the vertical evolution of the group of microbes that we are studying. So horizontal gene transfer should not be part of the story of these genes, although this is extremely hard to get. These are usually housekeeping genes. And again, since we are assuming that these genes were present in the last common ancestor, we want to use genes that have been preserved throughout the evolutionary history of the clade. So like common marker genes that we use have to do or have an impact in, for example, DNA replication, RNA synthesis, and things like that. So we usually use DNA or protein sequences depending on how much we can get or how much information we can get in the sequence from the sequences. I can get more into that if you are interested. And once we have our marker gene sequences, we do an alignment of the homologous positions. So in this case, this is the square is representing the homologous positions already aligned. And after that, we draw our phylogenetic tree. This is a very, very simplified pipeline of how to build a phylogenetic tree. Each of these steps comes with different problems, different issues that you have to be very careful in considering, but this is more or less what we do. Very simplified overview. So before the use of, or before all these sequences were available through omics, metagenomics, transcriptomics, and so on. The reconstruction of phylogenetic trees of microbes were based on single marker genes. The example I gave before, 16S rRNA. And as you can see, the idea of reconstructing phylogenetic trees is extremely old, and we can go back to Darwin, for example. This is the only figure that was included in his tree, the origin of species. And this is another phylogeny that is also extremely ancient. And this one here is the famous one presented by Fuss and collaborators. They were using the 16S rRNA. The other ones were kind of hypothetical. However, for example, for the case of 16S, we soon realized that 16S does not have enough information when studying divergent clades. So 16S is amazing to get an idea of the diversity of microbial clades in your sample, but not to resolve the evolutionary relationships or the evolutionary relationships of the organisms you are interested in. So since omics became available, now data seems to be not an issue anymore. So we can concatenate multiple multiple genes or marker genes to get that concatenated alignment. And this is the common strategy today. But what we don't know is whether all these universal genes or these marker genes have a good phylogenetic signal. And phylogenetic signal is a concept that, or a metric that tells you how good that evolutionary information is in a gene. So phylogenetic signal is extremely important when you are trying to resolve the evolutionary relationships in clades. So to try to figure out whether these marker genes that people have used in the past to reconstruct phylogenies were actually good in terms of phylogenetic signal, I was assessing their power to build or to resolve the evolutionary relationships among clades. So for this, I was using a set of marker genes that are supposed to be good for multi-domain phylogenies. So these are phylogenies in which you are including bacteria and archaea at the same time. And again, this is important because I was looking into these marine clades that are present in bacteria and archaea. So I was also interested in investigating the placement of these key clades. So to assess the phylogenetic signal in this marker gene that I talked about before, I use the internal certainty and the tree certainty metrics. So the only thing to keep in mind about these metrics is that it's an alternative metric to Bootstrap, because Bootstrap is biased when we are using multiple genes in the same alignment. Because you probably don't know this, but Bootstrap was designed for single gene phylogenies. And nowadays we are using multiple genes in the same alignment. So it's extremely biased. We shouldn't use Bootstrap. So the internal certainty and the tree certainty metrics are very important because they give us a support estimate that considers alternative internals. And so the TC is simply the average of all internal certainties. So the internal certainty is the support that each connecting node in the tree has. And the values go from 0 to 1. And the only thing you have to keep in mind is that the higher the tree certainty or the internal certainty, the better. So the better the phylogenetic signal. And that's what we wanted. So for this analysis, I was using 41 marker genes that are universally distributed in bacteria and archaea. So most genomes have these genes, because as you can see, they are involved in very essential mechanisms for cells. So for example, some of them were ribosomal, RNA polymerase subunits, intracellular trafficking, and tRNA synthetases. So these are the functions of the 41 marker genes I was analyzing. And as you can see, here I'm showing the tree certainty in the y-axis and the length of the marker gene. So it seems that the longer the gene, the better the phylogenetic signal. And the winner marker genes were actually the RNA polymerase subunits, because these are very long genes. And it seems ribosomal proteins were actually really bad because they are very short. And so what we did is concatenating marker genes based on the functions that these genes have. And so what we found when concatenating these marker genes, because remember I said using single genes is usually not enough to build phylogeny, and we found that actually ribosomal genes, when you concatenate them all together, they are good. And so the best marker gene set that we could find was by concatenating ribosomal and RNA polymerase genes. And it could be that this is because these genes have a very congruent evolutionary history, maybe because they are involved in a similar process. And it seems that using all the 41 marker genes is just adding noise to the analysis. So the moral of the story in this case was the less, the better in terms of phylogenetic. So another aspect that is very important about the reconstruction of phylogenies is how many genomes you are including in your phylogeny. So for this, we were comparing phylogenies that are built using an unbalanced and a balanced taxonomic representation. And so what we found is that actually the number of genomes you are including for each phylum has a really important impact in your phylogeny. And to explain this, I will use the Pathocybacteria or CPR as an example. This is a clade that has very small genomes because they are symbionts of other microbes. So as you can see here, there is some physical contact between the cells. And Pathocybacteria is a very important clade because people were suggesting that this clade is the most basal branching group within bacteria. But with our study, we just show that this previous finding was just a bias of the unbalanced taxonomic representation that people were using. So instead of being close to the root of bacteria, we found that Pathocybacteria is actually a sister group of Chloroflexi. So very briefly, to tell you what we learned about this project is that less is more, because including more data for the reconstruction of your tree is not always good, and it's actually detrimental for the quality of your genome, of your phylogenies. And okay, I will jump very briefly to the last story that I have for you today, which is again a time-lapse of bacterial and archaeal diversification in the ocean. So these are the clades I already talked about. And now that we have this nice pipeline for the reconstruction of trees, we can look into the evolutionary history of these clades. So this is a project that I work with Joseph Ueda from Virginia Tech and my PhD advisor, Frank Ilwood. So again, we were interested in these clades that are present in archaea and bacteria. And we looked into clades that were exclusively marine because this gives us the assumption that the last common ancestor of these clades was also marine. And we were also interested in these clades that are very well represented on the databases. So with this, I want to mention that these are not the only marine clades, of course, but these are very abundant, very well represented in the database, and we have very good evidence that the last common ancestor was already marine. So to try to figure out when these clades diversify in the ocean, we use molecular digging techniques. And these techniques are extremely interesting because we can go from relative distance, like, for example, what we get when we run a regular phylogenetic tree. We can transform this distance into absolute distance. So the branch length of the in the phylogenetic tree is equivalent to millions of years or billions of years. So we can actually know when a clade diversifies. I can get into the details of this technique if you want, but it's pretty interesting because we can link the diversification of each of the microbial clades with Earth's geological history. So I was doing the molecular dating of these clades, and this is what I got. Overall, I found that the emergence of these clades occurred in a span of 2 billion years. Again, for context, Earth is around 4.6 billion years old. So 2 billion years is an extremely long period of time. So in the x-axis of this figure, I'm showing you the age in millions of years. I'm also showing you the figure that I presented before, the oxygenation of the deep ocean, the surface ocean in the atmosphere. The y-axis here is showing the oxygen relative to present atmospheric levels. And each of these reaches is showing the last 1,000 basin cycles of the molecular dating analysis I did. And this is the crown node. So this is the dating of the last common ancestor of the marine clades. And so these reaches are just showing you the certainty that we have about the age of these clades. And as you can see here, the more in the past we go, the more uncertainty we have. And this is how the phylogenetic record works. So I classified the clades, the marine clades, based on the timing of the diversification. For example, we have early branching clades, and some of them diversified around the time or after the great oxidation event. This is again the timing when oxygen was becoming available for the first time. And this period of Earth history was characterized by having low productivity. And this is actually consistent with what we know about these microbes today, because some of these clades that I'm showing here with blue are facultative aerobes, so they can use other alternative electron acceptors other than oxygen, and they are very prevalent in oxygen minimum zones. So people have suggested, or actually we suggest, that oxygen minimum zones, so these are regions of the ocean where oxygen has very low concentrations. And this could be a refuge for these clades that were diversifying during the time when oxygen was available, but not at very high concentrations. After that, we have the diversification of late branching clades. That's how I named them. And they were diversified during a time where oxygen was increasing, as you can see here. And also the productivity of the ocean was going up as well. And the last ones, the most recent ones, are the late branching phototrophs, and they diversified during a time in which oxygen reached moderate levels, the oxygen levels we see today. And this is the time when the deep ocean became oxygenated as well. And these clades are extremely abundant in the open ocean today. So they are very important for the functioning of the ocean. So we were also interested in what were the key metabolic capabilities that potentially allow these clades to become abundant in the ocean. So for this analysis, we use stochastic mapping. So to explain you more or less how this method works, let's imagine that we have these 3 microbes phylogeny, and we are interested in trying to figure out when these microbes acquire flagella. And if we have like a parsimonious view of how this happened, we will say that the last common ancestor of these clades did not have flagella, because this microbe here, which is related with these other 2, does not have that trait. And the most parsimonious explanation is that the last common ancestor acquired that capability at some point here. So this is how stochastic mapping works. And it's very interesting because we can do this analysis on a broad diversity of traits. In my case, I was using protein. So I was trying to figure out when different proteins were acquired by the marine clades of interest. So I was trying to figure out, as I said, what traits or what proteins and what were the function of the proteins acquired by the last common ancestor of all these marine clades. And to do this, I don't want to overwhelm you with statistics. I can get into that if you're interested, but I was basically comparing an alternative model in which I use an all rates difference, and I was running each analysis 100 times, and I was comparing the distribution of this all rates different model versus a stochastic mapping analysis in which I use a constant rate. So this was like the null hypothesis. And I was running this analysis on all the proteins that were present in these genomes. So those comparisons that had a p-value below 0.01 were considered to be enriched proteins. So there was enough evidence to say that this protein was gained by the last common ancestor of all these clades. So, okay, what happened with the early branching clades? Again, they were diversifying during the time when oxygen was becoming available for the first time. And so the x-axis here is showing the different genes on functional categories that were gained. And the y-axis is showing the classification of the metabolic classification of all the proteins I was looking into. So just keep in mind that the blue dots are representing distributions in which there was a significant difference between the alternative and the null distribution. So I will give you a brief summary of what this means. And we found, for example, the enrichment of genes that are, for example, involved in oxidative phosphorylation, TCA cycle, and fatty acid degradation. And this probably has to do with the new oxygen that was available on the atmosphere, and this allowed these microbes to explode new niches, the new niches that were created by oxygen. And we found other genes that are involved in, for example, DNA repair, glutathione metabolism. This is an antioxidant. And it could be that these genes that were acquired by these clades in particular were involved in the adaptation to increasing salinity and oxygen. The late branching clades, these ones were diversifying during the time when oxygen was increasing in the atmosphere, but also in the ocean. They were enriched in some genes that might, or proteins that might be involved with the ecological interaction with eukaryotes. And this is the, potentially the phycosphere. So the phycosphere is this environment that surrounds eukaryotic cells, in which there is a metabolic interaction between microbial cells. The microbial cells are producing B vitamins for the eukaryotic cell, and the eukaryotic cell produces carbon-rich molecules. So these genes, for example, vitamin B6, folate, bacterial secretion system, and flagellar assembly, these genes suggest that the diversification of these clades might have been related with the diversification of eukaryotes that was happening around this time. So this was extremely interesting to us. And again, we see glutathione, taurine, so adaptations to increasing oxygen concentrations, apparently. And for the last clade, the late branching phototrophs, they diversified during the time in which oxygen reached modern concentrations. We see a lot of transporters in Crocospira. So this is a nitrogen fixer that is usually very abundant in the open ocean. They form these huge blooms. So it makes sense that the creation of these huge blooms in the ocean requires the efficient transportation of nutrients across the membranes. And the other clades, Prochlorococcus and Synechococcus, which are very abundant in the open ocean today, it seems that their diversification during this time was mostly linked to the modification of the photosynthetic apparatus. And this has to be been the case for Prochlorococcus especially. And we see taurine and hypothyroid metabolism that this has to do with salinity, especially. So what we know about this project, or after finalizing this project, was that the different marine clades that are very important in the ocean today emerged during very distinctive periods of Earth's history, and especially with very different concentrations of oxygen. And it seems that the physiology that we see in these microbes today is linked with the geochemistry of the ocean at the time of their emergence. And that's extremely interesting to me. The things we think we know after finishing this project is that the open ocean might be an extremely new environment. I can get into that idea if you are interested. And of course, what I would like to know after finishing this project is knowing more about the early diversification of other clades. So very quick advertisement before getting into questions. If you guys have questions, is that I will be starting a new lab at UC Santa Barbara this summer. And I'm looking for graduate students, PhD and masters. So if you are interested, please reach out. And also if you are interested in collaborating, my lab will be doing a lot of bioinformatics and sequencing of microbes. So yeah, please reach out. And these are more or less the things I will be doing. So benchmarking bioinformatic techniques, exploring new environments, and recovering high quality genomic data. With that, I would like to thank my collaborators, and thank you so much, and I'll take any questions.
Muchas gracias, doctora Carolina. Tenemos y abrimos la sesión de las preguntas, tanto para el auditorio físico como para el auditorio virtual. Le agradecemos mucho su exposición. Es muy interesante el tema, muy interesante lo que ha encontrado su grupo, bueno, el grupo con el que está colaborando. Y nos quedan poquitos minutos porque recordemos que después de esto sigue una clase en el auditorio. Entonces, podemos abrir la sesión de preguntas. Las personas que tengan preguntas en el auditorio físico, está la doctora Cristina, que les irá dando la palabra, por favor. Si tienen preguntas, levanten la mano y acérquense al micrófono. Y en el auditorio virtual pueden también levantar la manita que aparece en la parte de abajo de sus pantallas. Casi al centro de sus pantallas aparece la mano del lado derecho, en la parte de abajo. Adelante, iniciamos las preguntas. Ok, hay un comentario en el chat de Ana Patricia Holguín León. ¿Nos puedes hablar, por favor, un poquito de lo último que comentaste, de por qué piensan que el océano es un ambiente nuevo?
Sí, muchas gracias por la pregunta. Lo que creo es más bien que que el océano abierto, es decir, estas zonas del océano que están muy bajas en nutrientes y están muy alejadas de los márgenes continentales. Creo que es un ambiente nuevo porque el océano profundo, que es debajo de la zona fótica, bueno, la parte de arriba del océano depende en gran medida del océano profundo para el reciclaje de los nutrientes. Y como el océano profundo la concentración de oxígeno se volvió muy alta solo durante los últimos 500 millones de años, el océano abierto como lo conocemos ahora no podría existir sin la presencia de oxígeno en el océano profundo. No sé si está clara mi respuesta. Además de que la distancia del océano, del océano abierto con la parte continental ha cambiado a través de los años, de nuevo por la plate tectonics, porque los continentes se han estado moviendo mucho. Entonces, esa distancia del océano con la Tierra ha cambiado muchísimo durante los últimos millones de años.
Hola,
Comento.
Daniel.
Sí, muchas gracias. Está muy interesante. ¿Alguna pregunta en el auditorio?
Bueno, parece ser que aquí no hay preguntas, pero hay muchos estudiantes también que creo que vienen de Ecuador, ¿verdad? Bueno, Caro, ¿cómo le podías, muchas gracias por la presentación, ¿cómo les podías explicar en un tema acuícola cómo se inmersa tu tema de estudio?
Ya, esa es buena pregunta, porque mi investigación es más teórica, entonces es difícil, pero lo que yo puedo decir es que, de nuevo, como lo comenté, es importante saber bajo qué condiciones los diferentes clados marinos se diversificaron, porque eso nos puede dar una idea de cómo van a cambiar los grupos microbianos en el futuro. Es decir, si sabemos que un clado en particular que es importante para la acuacultura, no sé, X microbio, si sabemos que diversificó en un ambiente donde el oxígeno no era tan abundante, entonces podemos asumir que este microbio va a tener muy buenas condiciones de adaptación, es decir, va a poder adaptarse a condiciones donde el oxígeno no sea tan abundante, por ejemplo. Sí, yo creo que esa es la mejor manera de ver lo paralelo entre estos dos campos.
Gracias. Tengo una pregunta ya acerca de tu estudio. Decías que, por ejemplo, pues hay diferentes marcadores para identificar bacterias, ¿no?
Sí.
Por ejemplo, nosotros a nivel de acuicultura, pues diferentes investigadores y estudiantes aquí han realizado pues un montón de estudios enfocados a cómo cambia la microbiota cuando se alimenta con algo, cuando están enfermos, diferentes condiciones ambientales, ¿no? Entonces, pero estamos sujetos siempre a marcadores que pues sean muy común y que ya estén publicados la secuencia de estos organismos, ¿no? Porque si no, pues, ¿cómo los comparamos? Entonces,
Sí, claro.
generalmente se trabaja con el 16CS, pero tú decías que, por ejemplo, hay unos marcadores del RNA, que entre más grandes sean como mejores, ¿no? En tu punto de vista o desde tu punto de vista, cuando te enfrentas a una situación, por ejemplo, que quieres ver la diversidad, ¿cómo le haces? ¿Qué marcadores recomiendas o por qué evalúas tantos marcadores, no?
Sí, muchas gracias por tu pregunta. Yo creo que el 16S está bien para conocer la diversidad de microbios en una muestra. Puede ser problemático si no hay suficientes secuencias publicadas, por ejemplo, y no puedes llegar, por ejemplo, a nivel género o a nivel familia, puede ser difícil. Em, y además no puedes saber nada de las funciones, es decir, no puedes saber nada de la parte codificadora, o sea, de las funciones que puede tener un organismo. Pero para conocer las relaciones evolutivas más fondo, es decir, conocer la historia evolutiva de un clado de microbios, no puedes usar 16S, porque es un gen que se satura muy rápido, porque son nucleótidos, es decir, no codifica para una proteína, no puedes usar proteínas, por lo tanto, hay mucha saturación a nivel de nucleótidos. Pero sí, si tu idea es saber quién está en la muestra, yo creo que 16S puede ser bueno, pero no te puede llevar más allá de a saber, por ejemplo, las funciones o qué puede estar haciendo el microbio, es solamente quién está ahí.
Gracias. ¿Alguien más tiene una pregunta? Aquí hay una pregunta.
Buenos días, soy Rodrigo Hernández
Hola.
de Maestría. Muy interesante la presentación. Le quería preguntar con respecto a esto que mencionó sobre la distancia del mar abierto a tierra. ¿Tiene que ver con este aporte de tierra que le da a los océanos de, por ejemplo, fosfato, creo que es el
Exacto.
importante?
Sí, justamente. El océano abierto está muy diluido en nutrientes porque justamente está muy lejos de la Tierra, o sea, miles de kilómetros. Entonces, la parte continental, el input que puede tener el océano de, por ejemplo, materia orgánica es extremadamente limitado. Entonces, la productividad del océano abierto depende de los microbios que viven en el océano abierto y no de lo que ocurre en tierra. Entonces, cuando se genera materia orgánica por los mismos microbios que están fotosintetizando, esa materia orgánica se acaba inmediatamente, o sea, el proceso es extremadamente eficiente de nuevo. ¿Por qué? Porque no hay input de tierra. Es lo mismo para el nitrógeno, sí. No hay nitrógeno de tierra.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta en el auditorio. Ha llegado al final el tiempo del seminario. Agradecemos mucho a todos los asistentes y cualquier duda sobre el tema o cualquier comentario la podemos hacer llegar a la doctora Carolina a través de su correo electrónico que nos ha proporcionado o que se encuentra en la distribución, en el anuncio de distribución que se mandó a los correos de todos. Le agradecemos mucho a la doctora y a todos por haber estado aquí. Doctora Carolina, muchas gracias.
Gracias, hasta luego.
Gracias. Hasta luego, y nos vemos la siguiente semana. Que estén muy bien.